2 courtrooms, 2 verdicts, one name that still splits people right down the middle. In 2003, Steven Avery walked out of prison after DNA testing helped clear him of a violent crime he did not commit. Less than 3 years later, a young photographer named Teresa Halbach vanished after a routine work appointment. Avery was arrested, a jury convicted him, and the story turned into a modern American argument about what we trust more, the system that says it got it right, or the doubts that say it didn't. Before we go any further, I want to be clear about how we're going to do this. We'll separate what's confirmed in court records from what's alleged, debated, or still unknown. We're not here to romanticize anyone, and we're not here to treat a real person's death like a puzzle box. Teresa Halbach was a 25-year-old woman with a life, a family, and plans that never got to happen. She deserves to be centered in this story, not used as a prop in someone else's narrative. And if you're new here, consider subscribing now. Not for drama, but because by the end of this episode you'll have something most coverage skips. A clean, chronological map of what's known, what's disputed, and the single tip that haunts the entire timeline. One that, depending on who you believe, arrived too late to change anything, or arrived at the exact moment it mattered most. Now here's the question that will drive everything. How does a man proven innocent once end up convicted again, in a case that became one of the most watched true crime documentaries in history? To answer that, we have to start before Teresa Halbach. We have to start with a beach. In 1985, a woman named Penny Bernston was attacked near a Lake Michigan beach in Wisconsin. The details are important, but we don't need to be graphic to understand the stakes. She survived. She reported what happened. And the criminal justice system did what it does in cases like this. It moved quickly to identify and punish someone. Steven Avery, a local man from Manitowoc County, became the focus. Bernston identified him. Avery was convicted and sent to prison. He would spend 18 years behind bars. This is the first place the story gets uncomfortable, because it introduces a hard truth that has nothing to do with Steven Avery as a person, and everything to do with the system. Eyewitness identification can be compelling, and still be wrong. Juries trust it, judges trust it, the public trusts it, and when it points to the wrong person, it can set 2 tragedies in motion at the same time. An innocent person loses years of life, and the real offender remains free. Avery insisted he was innocent. Years passed. Advances in DNA testing changed what could be proven. Eventually, testing excluded Avery and pointed elsewhere. In September 2003, Avery was released after charges were dismissed. For the public, it was a rare moment of clarity. The system had made a mistake, and it had been corrected. But the correction didn't erase the damage. 18 years is not a footnote. It's an entire adulthood. If you want to pause here and weigh in, I'm curious what you think the fairest fix looks like after a wrongful conviction. Is it money, policy reform, accountability, all of the above? Or is there something else that matters more? Because Avery's release didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a place where people knew the names involved, where law enforcement and the community had lived with the case for years, and where a man who'd been wrongly imprisoned filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages, reportedly in the tens of millions, against county officials and others. That lawsuit matters, not because it proves anything about what happened to Teresa Halbach, but because it changes the temperature of everything that follows. It becomes part of the motive story in the public mind. If Avery is framed, people ask who benefits. If he's guilty, people ask, does the lawsuit distract us from the simplest explanation? And this is where we arrive at the first haunting phrase of this episode, a tip that arrived too late. Years before Avery's release, while he was still in prison, information surfaced suggesting someone else may have committed the 1985 attack. Different sources describe it differently, but the basic point, documented later in legal proceedings and testimony, is that a call came in from another jurisdiction, suggesting an inmate had made statements indicating responsibility for an assault that Manitowoc County had pinned on someone else. Think about that for a second. A phone rings, a message passes through hands, and somewhere inside that chain, a decision is made, whether by negligence, uncertainty, bureaucracy, or something darker, to do nothing that changes the outcome in time. If you've seen this case discussed online, you've probably heard the name Andrew Colborn in connection with that call. Colborn has described receiving a call and transferring it onward, and years later he wrote a statement about it. This tip has become symbolic. To some, it's proof the system closes ranks and protects itself. To others, it's proof that critics will turn any administrative moment into a conspiracy. What's confirmed is that the call and the later documentation became part of the larger public record around Avery's first case, and that it helped fuel a lasting distrust. And here's why it matters for Teresa Halbach. When a community watches the system get it wrong once, and then watches a second case unfold around the same name, people don't start from neutral. They start from memory. They start from suspicion. They start from a feeling, either that the system owes Avery a debt, or that Avery's first exoneration doesn't mean he can't be guilty of something else. That's the first major psychological trap in this story. Once we pick a side, we tend to collect facts like magnets. We pull in what supports our conclusion, and we push away what threatens it. So let's avoid that. Let's build the timeline from the ground up. Halloween, 2005. Teresa Halbach is a freelance photographer. She does assignments that, on paper, look ordinary. Meet someone, photograph a vehicle, move on to the next job. She has a family waiting for her in Wisconsin, a life that isn't public, a private person who suddenly becomes a headline. On October 31st, she goes to the Avery salvage yard property to photograph a vehicle for an auto sales publication. This is one of the last confirmed places she is known to have been. After that appointment, she disappears. Days pass and concern grows. When Teresa doesn't show up where she's expected and communication fails, her family reports her missing. This is the moment where an ordinary routine becomes a nightmare, where the most terrifying question appears in a family's life with no warning. Where is she? Law enforcement begins investigating. The last known destination matters, and that destination points straight toward the salvage yard property. Now, a crucial distinction: being the last known stop does not automatically mean guilt. But in real investigations, it's the first place you look. It's the first place you ask questions. It's where your timeline begins to tighten. Search efforts ramp up. People talk. Tips come in. The public gets involved. And then a major break. Teresa's vehicle, a dark blue Toyota RAV4, is found on or near the salvage yard property. This is where the case starts to harden into a story with objects instead of theories. A vehicle, a key, blood, DNA, burned remains recovered from areas on the property. If you've followed this case at all, you know those words are the backbone of the prosecution narrative. Teresa came to the salvage yard, and the physical evidence shows she never left. But this is also where the controversy begins, because the same objects that look definitive to one person look suspicious to another, depending on how they were discovered, who discovered them, and how the searches were conducted. Here's what we know in broad strokes. Investigators locate Teresa's vehicle. Items connected to Teresa are found. Avery's blood is identified inside the vehicle. A key said to belong to Teresa is found in Avery's residence. Later, other evidence is presented at trial, including forensic findings from the garage and burn areas. Those are not minor details. If you accept them as straightforward, the case feels overwhelming. So why does anyone doubt it? Because doubt doesn't grow in a vacuum. It grows in the gaps, in the timing of discoveries, in the unusual repetition of searches, in the involvement of agencies that, in the public's mind, had reasons to want Avery off the street, whether those reasons were personal, financial, reputational, or simply human. The salvage yard property is searched multiple times, and at the center of debate is the role of Manitowoc County officers. Critics say the county had a conflict because of Avery's lawsuit and should have been kept at arm's length. Supporters of the investigation argue that outside agencies were in charge, and that assistance from local officers does not equal corruption. This is one of those moments where two things can be true at once. It can be appropriate to use local resources in a large search, and it can also be reasonable to question the optics when the suspect has a history with the same county. And if you're watching this as a viewer trying to stay honest, your job is not to pick the more exciting explanation. Your job is to ask what the record supports. Now let's talk about the key, because the key is one of the most argued over objects in this entire case. According to the prosecution, Teresa's key is discovered during a search of Avery's residence. To the prosecution, it's a straightforward fact. A victim's property is found in the defendant's space. To the defense and many critics, the key is suspicious because of how and when it appears, and because it's discovered after earlier searches didn't turn it up. If you've ever watched people debate this case, you've seen how quickly a single object can become a symbol. The key isn't just a key. It becomes a referendum on whether you think the search was clean or compromised. So here's a comment question I want to ask you at this point. When you hear about evidence discovered after multiple prior searches, does your mind go first to that happens in real investigations, or first to that's a red flag? And what would you need to see to move your opinion in either direction? Because after the key, the evidence conversation expands fast. Avery's blood in the RAV4 is central. The prosecution argues it ties Avery directly to Teresa's vehicle after she went missing. The defense raises questions. How did the blood get there? When did it get there? And could it have been planted? One of the most famous claims involves a vial of Avery's blood from the earlier wrongful conviction case. The idea, popularized in public discussion, is that someone could have used stored blood as a planting source. The state argued that the blood in the RAV4 showed signs consistent with a fresh source rather than drawn and stored, and the court proceedings around these claims are complex. What matters for us is this: the blood becomes the strongest physical link, and therefore the strongest target for any alternative theory. And then there's Brendan Dassey. Brendan is Avery's teenage nephew. He becomes part of this story through interviews and interrogations that will later be dissected by legal analysts, psychologists, journalists, and viewers worldwide. Dassey gives statements to investigators. He confesses. He later recants. He is charged, tried separately, and convicted. Because of the nature of his statements, and because he was a minor, this part of the case is ethically sensitive. We don't need to repeat the most inflammatory allegations to understand why it matters. The reason it matters is simpler. Confessions are powerful to juries. And juvenile confessions, especially under pressure, have been studied for decades because of how easily they can be influenced by authority, fatigue, fear, and a young person's desire to please. If you've watched Making a Murderer, you've seen how the documentary frames these interrogations. But documentaries are edited narratives. They select, they emphasize, they omit. That doesn't mean they lie, but it does mean you can't treat them like raw footage of reality. The legal system wrestled with Dassey's confession for years. A federal judge granted relief at one point. Appeals followed. Higher courts ultimately left his conviction in place. Reasonable people disagree about what the interrogation shows, but the outcome is clear. Dassey remains incarcerated. And here's another moment to pause for comments. What safeguards do you think should exist when police question a juvenile, especially one with learning challenges or limited social understanding? Mandatory lawyer? Mandatory parent? No interrogation without recorded counsel? What would you change? Because this case is not only a murder case. It's an American case about how truth is produced, through witnesses, through objects, through procedures, and through the messy reality of human institutions. Now, around this point in the story, many retellings rush straight to the trial. We're not going to do that yet, because if you want to understand why the verdict is still debated, you need to understand the emotional geography first. In Manitowoc County, Avery wasn't just a defendant. He was a known figure. The salvage yard wasn't an abstract address. It was part of the local landscape. And Teresa Halbach wasn't a character. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone with a routine that should have brought her home. When her vehicle is found and evidence begins to stack up, the community is desperate for certainty. That's not evil. That's human. People want to believe the world is predictable. Bad things happen for a reason, and if we find the person responsible, the fear can be contained. And that brings us to the trials. In 2007, Steven Avery is tried and convicted of first-degree intentional homicide, along with another charge related to firearm possession as a felon. The prosecution presents a theory of the crime built around the physical evidence and the timeline of Teresa's visit. The defense challenges the investigation, the handling of evidence, and suggests alternative explanations, including the possibility of planting and a broader frame-up. Avery is convicted and sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Brendan Dassey is tried separately and also convicted, largely tied to his confession and supporting evidence arguments presented by prosecutors. From the state's point of view, the case is resolved, the verdicts stand, and the evidence supports them. From the defense and many critics' point of view, the case is a warning. A flawed investigation can still win in court, especially when the defendant is already viewed through the lens of a past. And then in 2015, Making a Murderer drops on Netflix, and the case detonates globally. Here's something we have to be careful about. Public attention is not the same thing as public proof. A documentary can raise excellent questions and still leave viewers with an incomplete picture. It can spotlight real concerns and still guide you emotionally toward a conclusion. What the series undeniably did was reopen the case in the court of public opinion. Suddenly, millions of people had opinions about Manitowoc County procedure, Wisconsin evidence handling, and the psychology of confessions. And that attention created a second afterlife for Teresa Halbach's death, one her family never asked for. In coverage like this, it's easy to focus on the men at the center of the controversy and forget the person who is gone. So let's anchor again. Teresa Halbach was murdered. Her family lost her. And regardless of where you land on Avery's guilt or innocence, the tragedy at the center is not debatable. Now let's talk about appeals, because this is where many viewers feel lost. Avery's post-conviction efforts span years. Motions, requests for hearings, arguments about newly discovered evidence, claims involving third-party suspects, requests for additional scientific testing. In Wisconsin, one legal framework that comes up repeatedly in this context is the idea of presenting evidence that another specific person may have committed the crime. The bar for that is not, I have a hunch. It's not, this person seems suspicious. Courts require a meaningful connection between the third party and the offense, not speculation. A major piece of debate in recent years has involved a witness affidavit that defense attorneys argue supports an alternate suspect theory. Courts examined whether the motions were pled with enough factual support to justify an evidentiary hearing. In early 2025, the Wisconsin Court of Appeals issued a decision denying Avery's request for an evidentiary hearing, concluding the motion was insufficiently pled and that allegations implicating an alternate suspect were not supported by evidence as presented. If you're someone who believes Avery is innocent, decisions like that feel like a door slammed without a chance to fully argue. If you believe Avery is guilty, decisions like that feel like the system doing what it should, refusing to reopen a case based on claims that don't meet the legal standard. Avery's legal team petitioned the Wisconsin Supreme Court to review the denial. In May 2025, the Wisconsin Supreme Court denied the petition for review. So as of now, the convictions remain intact. And this is the part where I'm going to do something important. I'm going to resist the temptation to tell you what to believe. Because the most ethical thing I can do with a case like this is not to manufacture certainty. It's to show you why certainty is so hard here. Let's lay out the core tensions clearly. On one side, you have physical evidence presented at trial. The victim's vehicle found on the property, Avery's blood inside that vehicle, the victim's key found in Avery's residence, and forensic evidence tied to areas around Avery's home and garage. On the other side, you have procedural and contextual concerns. Avery's history of wrongful conviction, his lawsuit against local officials, the involvement of the same county in searches, the timing and manner of key evidence discoveries, and the broader argument that once a narrative forms, evidence can be interpreted or mishandled in ways that reinforce that narrative. Then there's Brendan Dassey, a teenager whose confession and recantation became its own worldwide debate about interrogation ethics and reliability. And over all of it, the public pressure, the human desire for a story that makes sense. Now we're at the midpoint of this episode, and if this has been useful so far, tap like once. It helps these careful, non-sensational deep dives reach people who actually want the timeline, not the shouting match. Let's go deeper into the phrase, the tip that arrived too late, because I promised we'd come back to it. In Avery's first case, the tip represented a missed chance, information suggesting the wrong person might be imprisoned, moving too slowly through a system built on paperwork and hierarchy. In the Halbach case, people argue about a different kind of late tip, evidence, witnesses, and theories that emerge years after a conviction, trying to reopen a case that the courts consider settled. And that raises a difficult question. When does too late become a moral failure? And when does it become the necessary finality of a legal system that can't relitigate every case forever? If a court opens the door too easily, finality collapses. Families never get closure. Victims' loved ones relive trauma endlessly. But if a court keeps the door locked too tightly, wrongful convictions can calcify into permanence. This is where the Avery case has become bigger than the people involved. It's now a symbol used by different groups to argue for different reforms. Better evidence preservation, better interrogation standards for juveniles, better protocols for eyewitness identification, stricter conflict of interest rules in investigations, and more transparency in forensic testing. But symbols can also distort. They can cause us to treat Teresa Halbach as background noise in a debate about institutions. They can cause us to elevate the loudest voices instead of the most careful ones. So let's honor Teresa again in a practical way, by refusing to let this become entertainment at her expense. The questions we ask should be in service of truth and accountability, not spectacle. Now, if you followed this case online, you've probably encountered a long list of if this, then that arguments. If evidence was planted, who planted it, how, and why without leaving a trail? If the investigation was clean, why do certain discoveries feel unusually? Time to critics? If Brendan's confession is unreliable, what does that mean for the narrative prosecutors presented, and what does it not mean? If Avery was a target because of his lawsuit, why would a conspiracy risk exposure on such a scale? Those questions can spin forever. And that's exactly why this case is so sticky. It's wide enough to hold multiple competing narratives without easily snapping closed. But we can still be honest about what the courts have said, because court decisions don't tell us what feels true. They tell us what meets a legal standard. The appellate courts have repeatedly upheld Avery's conviction and denied requests for new hearings under the arguments presented. That doesn't automatically mean the investigation was perfect. It means that, under the law, the challenges did not clear the bar required to reopen the case. To some viewers, that's reassuring. To others, it's terrifying. And that leads us to one last comment prompt, maybe the most important one. If you could order one thing in this case, one test, one hearing, one piece of evidence unsealed, one procedure audited, what would it be and why? Because the answer reveals what you trust. Do you trust physical evidence most, and want more testing to confirm it? Do you trust procedure most and want a hearing to examine how evidence was found? Do you trust patterns of institutional behavior and want an outside review of conflicts? Or do you trust the finality of verdicts and believe the endless relitigation is its own injustice? Now we're coming to the part of the story that, for many people, is the real ending, not the verdict, but the legacy. Teresa Halbach's family has had to live with a grief that the world turned into content. They've publicly maintained their belief in the convictions, and they've watched strangers argue about their loved one as if she's a plot device. No matter what you believe about Avery, that reality should make us slow down and speak carefully. Steven Avery remains incarcerated, serving a life sentence without parole. Brendan Dassey remains incarcerated as well, after years of litigation over the voluntariness of his confession. Avery's post-conviction efforts have continued through filings and petitions, including a petition for review that the Wisconsin Supreme Court declined to take in 2025. The case remains a lightning rod, but legally, the verdict stands. So what do we do with a case like this? Here's my take, and I'm offering it as a meaning, not a verdict. This case isn't just about Steven Avery. It's about how badly we want the world to be coherent. How quickly we choose a narrative that makes us feel safe. How painful it is to admit that two different possibilities can both feel plausible when you only see part of the picture. It's also about the cost of error, the cost of getting it wrong the first time, and the cost of not being believed the second time. And it's about Teresa Halbach, because no matter where you land, a young woman lost her life, and a family lost their daughter. That should be the emotional center we return to every time the debate starts to drift into entertainment. If you stayed to the end, thank you for taking the careful route through a case that usually gets turned into a shouting match. If you want more investigations like this, slow, sourced, and respectful, subscribe. And if you're looking for a natural next watch, I'll link another case where procedure, evidence, and public narrative collide in a way that forces the same hard question. What do we do when certainty feels earned, but doubt refuses to leave?